The year is 1996, and the humid air of the Las Vegas Strip is thick with the scent of ozone and expensive cologne. A black BMW 750 sedan sits idling at a red light, its occupant a man who had become the most analyzed, feared, and adored figure in American music. Within seconds, the silence is shattered, and a cultural trajectory is altered forever. But while the world mourned the man, a silent observer in a windowless office miles away was simply closing a folder. This wasn't just any file, it was a curated history of a life lived under the microscope of the state. For years, the FBI had been quietly stitching together a tapestry of Tupac Shakur's existence, not merely as a musician, but as a perceived threat to the very fabric of national stability. What did they see when they looked at him? Was he truly the kingpin of a criminal enterprise, or was he a victim of a decades-old vendetta against his bloodline? As we peel back the redacted layers of these declassified documents, we find a story that isn't just about rap lyrics or coastal rivalries. It is a story of paranoia, sophisticated surveillance, and a global system that feared the power of a single voice more than the violence it claimed to investigate. If stories like this fascinate you, subscribe to join us as we uncover hidden global truths. And tell us, where are you watching from? This is the anatomy of a shadow. The FBI's interest in Tupac Amaru Shakur did not begin with a platinum record or a controversial interview. It began before he drew his first breath. To the Bureau, Tupac was never just a solo act. He was a biological extension of a movement they had spent decades trying to dismantle. His mother, Afeni Shakur, had been a prominent member of the Black Panther Party, a woman who famously defended herself in court while pregnant with Tupac, facing charges of conspiracy against the government. When the agents opened his file, they weren't just looking at a teenager from Baltimore or a rising star in California. They were looking at a legacy target. The documents reveal a chilling continuity of surveillance, where the sins, or rather, the activism of the parents were meticulously visited upon the son. In the quiet suburbs of Middle America and the high-rise offices of European intelligence agencies, the rise of the new Panther was viewed with a mixture of clinical fascination and deep-seated dread. The declassified files suggest that the Bureau wasn't just tracking crimes, they were tracking a pedigree. They noted his every move not because he was selling drugs, but because he was selling an ideology that resonated far beyond the borders of the Bronx. For a government that had spent the 1960s and 70s obsessed with the Messiah complex, the fear of a black leader who could electrify the masses, Tupac represented a terrifying evolution. He had the rhetoric of his mother and the reach of a global pop star. Could this happen in your country too, where a family's history dictates their future in the eyes of the law? As the file grew thicker, the Bureau's focus shifted from his ancestry to his associations, specifically a radical group known as the Black Liberation Army. The documents detail a haunting level of granularity. Agents weren't just monitoring his concerts, they were tracking the internal communications of his extended family, many of whom were still in exile or incarcerated. To the observers in Washington, Tupac was a bridge between the street-level grit of the 90s and the militant intellectualism of the 70s. They saw a man who could unify the disparate gangs of Los Angeles under a single political banner, a prospect that analysts in the documents described as a national security concern. This was the birth of the potential threat narrative. While the public saw a charismatic artist, the FBI's surveillance teams were documenting his influence on the youth of the African diaspora, noting how his message was beginning to echo in the disenfranchised suburbs of Paris and the townships of South Africa. The files reveal that the government was less interested in the artist and more obsessed with the organizer. They watched as he began to speak of thug life not as a criminal pursuit, but as a social code for the oppressed. This shift in rhetoric prompted an escalation in the file's classification. The state was no longer just watching a celebrity, they were monitoring the emergence of a revolutionary who had found a way to bypass the gatekeepers of media. When the rivalry between Death Row Records and Bad Boy Entertainment began to dominate the headlines, the world saw a tragic clash of egos and geography. However, the declassified FBI files paint a far more clinical and perhaps more sinister picture. To the federal agents watching from the periphery, the East Coast-West Coast War, wasn't just a tabloid sensation, it was a strategic opportunity. The documents show that the Bureau was closely monitoring the tension, yet there is a conspicuous lack of intervention. Analysts today look at these files and see a familiar pattern: the hands-off approach to internal community conflict. While the streets burned and the rhetoric turned deadly, the observers remained silent, meticulously documenting the fracture of a movement that had once threatened to unite. Across the Atlantic, intelligence analysts in London and Berlin were baffled by the intensity of the violence. They watched as the American music industry, a major export of cultural soft power, appeared to be eating itself alive. Within the FBI's own reports, there is evidence of undercover sources embedded deep within the entourages of these rap icons. These confidential informants were providing real-time data on the movements of Tupac and his associates. This raises a chilling question that challenges our assumptions. If the government had ears in the room when the threats were being made, why was nothing done to de-escalate the situation? The files suggest that the state was content to let the chaos play out, perhaps realizing that a culture divided against itself is far easier to manage than one united against the system. Tell us your thoughts in the comments. We love hearing from you. The tension reached a breaking point in the mid-90s, and the FBI's files during this period read like a tactical war room log. The Bureau began investigating an extortion plot by a group known as the Black Mafia, who were reportedly shaking down various figures in the industry, including Tupac. But rather than offering protection, the FBI's documentation focuses on the potential for these criminal elements to further destabilize the rap community. The files reveal a web of death threats that reached as far as the high-level executives, creating an atmosphere where violence was not just possible but inevitable. The state was documenting a slow-motion train wreck, capturing the moments where music stopped being art and started being a casualty of a larger geopolitical game of chess. The global reaction to this escalation was one of shock and curiosity. For international fans, the image of Tupac, the rebel of the underground, being squeezed by both the federal government and organized crime presented a grim paradox of the American dream. The declassified files hint at a disturbing irony. While the FBI claimed to be investigating organized crime, their presence often seemed to act as a catalyst for paranoia. The documents suggest that the surveillance itself became a source of stress that pushed the players into more defensive and eventually aggressive postures. By the time the final shots were fired in Las Vegas, the Bureau had thousands of pages on a man who was only 25 years old, creating a digital ghost that would outlive the flesh and blood human. In the wake of the tragedy, the files didn't close. They became a post-mortem of a cultural era. The final sections of the declassified documents are perhaps the most haunting, as they transition from active surveillance to an autopsy of influence. The tone of the reports shifts to a cold, reflective analysis of the Shakur phenomenon. Agents noted the global mourning that followed, documenting how his face appeared on murals from the favelas of Brazil to the war-torn streets of the Balkans. The quiet truth buried in the redacted lines is that the state recognized what the public was only starting to realize. Tupac's death didn't silence his message, it sanctified it. The Bureau's attempts to manage his influence had failed, as his voice became a permanent fixture in the global struggle for identity and justice. The final pages of the declassified ledger reveal a profound bureaucratic realization. They had spent years trying to quantify a spirit that refused to be contained by a filing cabinet. The documents conclude not with a conviction or a closed case, but with an acknowledgement of his lingering power. Foreign diplomats and cultural observers noted that while the man had been removed from the board, his archetype had become a blueprint for resistance across the globe. The FBI's obsession with his revolutionary roots had ironically helped document the birth of a secular saint. In those windowless offices, the analysts finally saw the truth, that you can monitor a phone call and you can track a vehicle, but you cannot redact the resonance of a voice that speaks for the voiceless. This silent ledger reminds us that the cost of a voice is often a lifetime of scrutiny. The documents don't just tell us about Tupac. They tell us about the nature of power and the fear that genuine, unfiltered human expression can strike into the heart of an empire. As we close the file on what the FBI truly found, we are left with the image of a man who was chased by shadows his entire life, only to become a light that the shadows could never fully extinguish. The global meaning of his story is found in the cracks between the redacted lines, a reminder that while systems of surveillance are vast and cold, they are ultimately powerless against the enduring truth of a human story. In the end, these declassified files reveal a story that is as much about the watchers as it is about the watched. They show us a world where influence is treated as a threat and where the history of one's family can become a roadmap for state suspicion. But more than that, they prove that even the most sophisticated surveillance can only capture the surface. While the Bureau documented the movements, the associates, and the conflicts, they could never capture the soul of the movement Tupac ignited. These stories reveal that while borders and bureaucracy may seek to divide and define us, the resonance of a single, authentic voice can remind us that we share a common fate, written in a ledger that no government can ever truly close. The files may be declassified, but the truth remains a revolution that refuses to be filed away.